that's not what it says.
Happy Valentine's Day.
And then it's,
Love, 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 love.
Love you.
what?
I was driving in today and just thinking about the last lecture and how I feel I kind of threw a curveball at you at the very end. A little case study which didn't have much background to it. A story of a woman who had called me up on the telephone and said she was undergoing hallucinations which seemed like full-blown realities to her of being swooshed into her mother's and other family members' bloodstreams. And I touched the sort of quasi-interpretation comment that I made to her after listening to this and hearing what her doctor, what her therapist had told her, that she was delusional, psychotic. In my association that I had, that maybe her family was a bunch of vampires, and that this feeling of being swept into people's bloodstreams was a symbolic metaphor of something she was experiencing in her family system. And I couldn't find a better way to say it than to say maybe they're all a bunch of vampires. And it blew her away because no one had ever said such a thing against her family before. And it validated actually a powerful, powerful feeling that was there, but had never really taken form in an explicit way. The only form it took was this hallucination. Let me tell you more about that case, though, because you might think, well, that was a brilliant idea, George, to tell her that her family was a bunch of vampires, and maybe that has something to do with why she's being swept into their bloodstreams. That was just the beginning, the very barest beginning of my relationship with this woman. This is one of the hardest cases I've ever experienced in my whole life, as it turned out. Not even sure where to begin. I have to work my way back into that time and that frame of reference and so on. It's back to 12, 14 years now, when all this was starting with her. I'll just give you like little bits and pieces and hope that they assemble themselves into a more or less coherent story and account. This woman was in so much trouble that I had to see her, or talk to her, at least on the telephone, every single day for the next 5 years. Like, I didn't let a single day go by, Christmas, Easter, whatever, no day passed that I wasn't at least on the telephone with her. I did that in order to try to keep her alive, because she was in a devastating state, struggling with a storm of emotion that was released as our relationship began to unfold. What did it come from? It came from the fact that although she had had upwards of 12 or 13 years of psychoanalytic therapy, her therapy, 8 years with the analyst that she was seeing when she called me, and 4 or 5 more besides that with someone else, none of her therapy had ever touched the heart of the matter with her, which is that she had been the victim of some of the most atrocious, sadistic abuse of anyone I've ever seen or heard from. And I'm not going to tell you too many details of the abuse that she suffered, but she was another case where if I were to give you a graphic description of it, it would maybe take me an hour to go through the major highlights of what was done to her. We would need wheelbarrows brought over from Tillett Hall to haul you guys out of here. It would be so upsetting to listen to, because it is stories of cruelty perpetrated against her by an older brother, actually, that defies our ability to believe anyone could be so cruel. It started when she was perhaps 2. Her brother was maybe 7 at the time, about 5, 6 years older than she. And I'll just give you a few things that he liked to do to her. But he was a cunning, sadistic monster. And among other things, the easiest things of all would be the rapes, oral, anal, vaginal, repeatedly. All the while, as the rapes are being conducted, saying horrible, abusive, hateful things to her in her ear, calling her names and so on. So that's one. He, on more than one occasion, locked her in a wooden box and nailed it shut and poured dirt on it, convincing her that she was being buried alive and would never get out again. So terrorizing experiences of being buried alive was there too. He would tie her in a chair, and where she couldn't move, and her face was locked into a forward position facing him, and he would torture and murder little animals, like little hamsters and things like that, or he would take crabs sometimes and climb up to a height like 12 or 14 feet in the air where she's tied in the chair sitting there, and he would drop the crabs onto concrete, and of course they crack wide open and die. He once took her favorite doll, a little doll that she loved above all things on heaven and earth, tied her in the chair, and then made her watch as he slowly crucified the doll on a little makeshift cross, and then set the doll on fire after it had been nailed on the cross. So you guys, give you a little bit of the flavor of what it is. It's not just being an older brother who's mean and pinches and pinches. Like I used to pinch my sister until she beat the shit out of me a couple of times, and then taught me not to do that. All right. Like the meanest thing I ever did to her was probably pinched her once. Then another thing I used to do to her was she was 3 years younger than I. Were given the job of washing the dishes. And so one would wash, one would dry the dishes. So I would wash and she would dry. But sometimes I noticed she would stay away from the drying rack so the dishes dried themselves. And it really pissed me off because she needs to dry the dishes, so I would wash them down again. And she'd get all mad and hit me for that. That's about the meanest thing I ever did in my life to anybody that I can think of. This guy was just off the scale. It was so, so bad. There's more to it. It's that I'm not going to tell you more stories. I could, and they would upset you terribly to hear them. Putting instruments inside of her and objects and live animals stuffed up inside of her, and just terrible, terrible things. Here's the problem. It's not just that she had trauma. The trauma had never surfaced. It was all there, but in a more or less dissociated state. So she didn't really remember it very well, kind of knew vaguely about it, but didn't have the full emotional intensity of the experience. And as she and I got going, it became unleashed. Pandora's box began to open. The volcano began to blow. And so for the next 5 to 6 years, she was flooded with flashbacks, nightmares, hallucinations that she was back in the abusive situation, just reliving the whole thing from top to bottom. And as such trauma always does, it made her want to die. And it was a battle to keep her alive during that period. That's why I was seeing her and talking to her so much. I had to talk to her every day. I was convinced that she could lose her life even so. In the course of this period, 5-6 years, I thought I had lost her a number of times because she became massively addicted to a variety of drugs and alcohol. Often would overdose herself real badly and sleep for 48 hours, and I couldn't reach her, and I would never struggle with whether to send the cops or ambulances there to pick her up. I thought she might have died, but each time she managed to survive. So very, very stressful. Just took so much out of me. You have no idea. Some of these cases can do. Luckily, I haven't had too many of these. Only about 6 or 7 in the whole course of my life. More than that would take a therapist down. And I've known people taken down by these patients too. Therapists can be injured, massively traumatized by their clinical work sometimes. And I find especially when the threat of suicide is very, very high, very intense, that the stress that I experience just goes off the scale. I thought that was the worst thing that I could ever experience as a therapist, would be when living with the possibility of a suicide taking place. I found something worse than that when one of my patients told me convincingly that she was coming to murder my children instead of killing herself. I found that's even more stressful than worrying about the patient committing suicide, okay? Luckily, that did not happen. We got through that okay. You will hear that story later on in the class, another very, very difficult case. I like to pull my most difficult cases. You don't get to hear my easy cases. Like I have lots of cases that are just like George Atwood or like you. Just kind of sort of jerky, stupid, depressed people who are all screwed up by their lives, basically. In other words, just normal life, in other words. But I like to take these very dramatic stories instead. They illustrate things more interestingly, and they make better listening for you guys, usually. Anyway, so what more about my case? In addition to there being vast early trauma at the hands of an older brother, you have to ask what went on in that family system to allow such abuse in the first place, or to stimulate it. This is about the whole family somehow. It can't be just the brother happened to be weird. Here's a story that leads to a story that told the heart of the matter with regard to the term enmeshment comes to mind, in terms of how her identity was wrapped up with other family members, and especially her mother's. One day, she would have been maybe 5 or 6 years old. Her brother was having his way with her. It was a vaginal rape. He was raping her. And she cried out because her mother was in the next room. Mom, help me, he's hurting me, he's hurting me, he's hurting me. And her mother then was heard to scream out, "Why are you killing me?" In other words, her response to the cry for help was to accuse her daughter of killing her, the mother. That's what this mother was like. I came to know this mother quite well, actually, in the course of our treatment. She finally died of old age, but she was someone who would be like this. There's a story, a famous story in this patient's background, which I can tell, which she and I came to know as the story of the kitchen table. And it occurred when she was 7 years old, and it speaks volumes. Sometimes there's a story in a person's life, and a therapist and a patient kind of go over that story. And the story often refers to something literally that did happen historically, but it also symbolizes some essential point of the person's life, some great theme that just repeats and repeats and repeats. Don't worry about the terms for that. There's a term you're not responsible for. Model scene is the term that is sometimes used for this by a friend of mine named Joe Lichtenberg, a psychiatrist in Washington, D.C. Anyway, one fine day, the patient was 7 years old. She was playing in the front yard. And her mother called her in. Jenny? I call her Jenny. No, I'm not calling the other one Jenny. I don't know what I call this one. Jane. Jane, come in here right now. Okay, Mom. So little Jane, 7 years old, comes into the kitchen. And they sit down at the kitchen table with the mother across from her. And the mother says, I have something very important to tell you. This is going to be unbelievable to you guys, but these things can and do happen. Here's what I have to tell you, Jane, said the mother. When you were born, I died. On your day of birth into this world, I wore black because it was my funeral. You lived, I died. I couldn't live if you lived. So you were allowed to live, and I was made to die. Do you hear me? Do you understand me? I'm dead because of you, said the mother to the child. This little girl is listening to this, and she's 40 years old when she's recounting this to me. But it's coming back to her at the moment of her recounting in all of its original intensity and emotionality. And the mother said, and there's more. Since my life ended when yours began, it is now your job to have all the experiences and do all the things that I wasn't allowed to have because I had to die so you could live. Do you understand me? And I asked the patient how she felt. How she remembered feeling, being talked to that way and being told such things about herself. And she said, she kind of leaned back in the chair is what she remembered, and the whole world seemed to go tilt, like on a pinball machine or something. Everything just went out of kilter and didn't make sense. But nothing was the same after that again. Something changed in her identity. Really, it was a kind of surrender to the traumatic power of the mother's insisting that she live for her. So I don't know if you guys can see, but there's a direct linkage between the notion that she should live for her mother and this idea of being swept into her mother's bloodstream. That's a vivid visual image that has to do with being consumed by the mother's being. This is what's happening there. I couldn't believe the story which you told me about. Oh my God. And then I saw also that what had taken place in the family after that incident at the kitchen table was that this little girl became Mommy's caregiver. She became a kind of junior mother to her mother, a kind of emotional counselor, psychotherapist to her mother, later a financial support to the mother. And the mother was living with her at this time and being taken care of exclusively by her very careful attention, really. So she had become her mother's slave, in keeping with the mother's insisting that she live for her, as was described in the incident at the kitchen table. And I remember a thought came into my mind after I heard this whole story and a lot of details on it that I'm not bothering to tell you, but we talked about it for a whole hour. I said to the patient, well, this is the issue, the enmeshment, the incredible dependency of the mother upon the daughter that was still present, age 40. This is now 33 years later. I said, I have a film I want to recommend for you to watch. It's about just this sort of thing, about the circumstances under which people become enmeshed, and it sort of points out a pathway out. Normally I don't recommend films to people. It doesn't really occur to me to do that. I think it rarely works well, but I couldn't resist this time. And I had seen this film not too long before that. She said, what is that film? I said, Throw Mama from the Train. Have you guys ever seen it? Danny DeVito, Billy Crystal. It's a fabulous movie about how you just sometimes have to murder your mother. Doesn't succeed in doing it in the film, as it turns out. It was partly a joke, but partly serious. She got the film and watched it really carefully and enjoyed it a lot. But then she found another film herself, my patient, that she said was much more the story. Maybe many of you have seen it, The Matrix. How many of you have seen The Matrix? A lot of you have seen The Matrix. The Matrix was perfect because what is the story of The Matrix? It's about a kind of takeover of the world by machines, and then the reduction of human beings to just being organic batteries to support the system of the machines operating. And then the human beings rebel against it and try to reassert their independence and freedom. That's the basic story of The Matrix. It's a wonderful symbol of what an enmeshed family system can do when a child's identity is swept into the agenda of serving the needs and desires of others, to the exclusion of the child having any life of his or her own at all. That's what The Matrix is really about symbolically. Okay? So, I don't know what to tell you about it, except we had 5 years working with her, struggling through her addictions. She was hospitalized 3 or 4 times after suicide attempts. She fell down drunk once and got a terrible concussion, was in the hospital for that. I thought I lost her many times. Finally, it began to lift. That's what happens. No matter how bad the traumas are, if you stay with them, they are not infinite. No matter how bad they are, they can only be as bad as what can happen to a person within a certain span of years. It did begin to lift, and she's okay now. And I hardly see her at all. I see her once a month maybe, or something like that at the most, or talk to her now and then. Okay? Now, the story I gave you about her, though, was focused more on the beginning episode about her calling me with the hallucination of being swooshed into the family's bloodstreams, primarily her mother, but really the other family members too. Let me see if I can return to that. This is all under the category of the third boulder. Remember, the third boulder is the third great obstacle to phenomenological understanding. And the essential idea here is that this third obstacle, it has to do with the doctrine of reality, spelled with a capital R, meaning an attitude the clinician brings to understanding people where they compare the patient's experience to their own sense and belief as to what is absolutely real. And they measure the difference between the two. And the patient is seen, if they don't agree with the standard of what is ultimately real, is seen then as distorting, delusional, in need of correction. Okay? That is anti-phenomenological. A phenomenological approach doesn't use the concept of reality, the capital R, as an absolute. It sort of lives in a pluralistic universe where everyone has his own reality. They may differ with each other, they may agree with each other, they may partially overlap. But one is not intrinsically more valid than the next, is the idea. Now, there are a couple of other features of the phenomenological approach that are connected to this and not exactly the same thing. I want to go over them too. One is how we listen to things that are said. It kind of goes with the doctrine of reality with a capital R, that you listen to things literally. So a person says they're swept into somebody's bloodstream. You hear that you hear that in physical, geometrical terms. You say to yourself, that's impossible. There's no room inside anybody's blood vessels for another person. It can't be true. You're kind of hypnotized by the literal discrepancy between what is being said and what you believe is physically possible in this universe. But a phenomenological approach is really soft in how it listens to things. It listens at one level to the literal content, okay, there it is. But another level, it might be metaphorical, symbolic. It might be saying something else. It's kind of a soft way of listening. And there can be multiple levels of meaning of what someone says. They say this one thing, and the propositions assert a certain state of affairs to be the case. But you don't have to hear it on that literal levels. Phenomenology, you can kind of hear it at all levels at once. You can pick and choose which one you want to focus on. And the one I was picking and choosing here was a metaphorical one that would highlight the thing as a metaphor of an enmeshed family system, or an enmeshed identity of a child in the being and in the agenda of the mother. That was the basic idea. Let me go on to another story now that illustrates this as dramatically, that involves both a sudden confrontation with something that seems to violate reality as we know it, but the solution came in the form of a soft listening to what was being said and an understanding of the metaphor it contained, which then provided a way to respond that made all the difference in the world. This case is Jenny, what I have written up here, and I titled this Jenny, the most hated woman on earth. I'm going to tell you why she was the most hated woman on earth. This is obviously my dramatic way of putting something. The patient is 30, 32, 33 years old at the time of this story. This case description does not come out of my practice. It comes out of the practice of a colleague of mine who's a brilliant analyst and a dedicated clinician, and I have the greatest respect for her. And she told me the story, and although I'm one of her teachers and consultants, and the story that I'm going to tell that she told me did involve some things she had learned from me, or were consistent at least with the kind of ideas that I have. But she performed the whole thing all by herself, and I was very proud of her and very happy with how it all worked out. I'm going to tell it to you. The story is about a crisis moment in a long psychotherapy that took place between her and this young woman that could have ended in absolute catastrophe, but she pulled the iron out of the fire at the last minute, as you'll see. The story is of Jenny, the most hated woman on earth. Why is she the most hated woman on earth? Who was she hated by? Well, her original family hated her and wanted nothing to do with her. Her mother, her father, her cousins had long since cut off all contact with her. She had not been able to make and hold on to any friendships with anyone all through her growing up period and through her adolescence and young adulthood. Everyone hated her guts. Why? Because of a strategy she had developed for survival, which I call a strategy of preemptive counterattack, and I'm going to describe it to you. Her way of being with other people was to kind of have a radar on at all times for anybody being critical, rejecting, insulting, or disapproving of her in any way at all. She's always looking and searching for any sign of anything like that. And at the first faint sign of what looks like anything that would emerge as something negative being said to her, or some negative action taken in relation to her, she would attack before it could even take place. So what did that translate into? Well, she would walk down the street, and if she saw a man coming toward her from the other way, and he looked up and down her body maybe, or something like that, she would instantly feel he was objectifying her and turning her into a sex object. So before his eyes could even go from her face to her hips or something, she started screaming at him, and she had a foul mouth. And I'll imitate her a little bit. Try not to be offended by this. Fuck you, you fucking asshole. Just a complete stranger, okay? Go like that, all right? She was like this with everyone all the time. If you were on the subway and maybe you're just sitting across from her in the subway, and maybe one of your eyebrows goes up a little bit for some reason. I don't know why a person's eyebrows go up, but one eyebrow goes up. Maybe it's a look like of. You could interpret that sometimes as a look of doubt a person has. You know, really, or something like that. A look of doubt. She'd see that. You know, once again, shove that eyebrow up your ass. You'd be happier up there, wouldn't it, than me having to look at you, asshole, you motherfucking bastard. People couldn't stand her, but her friendships had all succumbed to this, and she'd been this way with her analyst as well. Let me see if I can tell another story. She'd lost job after job after job for this same reason. How many jobs? I don't know. She'd been trying to work on and off for maybe 10, 12 years, and she must have had 12, 15, 20 jobs during that period. She'd always get fired. It's always the same story. It's the same thing. So here's just one story to tell you how this preemptive counterattack worked to subvert her professional career at all. One of the jobs she got was as a receptionist for a lawyer, or maybe it was a doctor, it doesn't matter. A professional person who needed a receptionist to man the phones and greet the people who would come for appointments in the morning, okay? So on the very first day of her work for the person in this story, she arrived early. He wasn't there yet. She had been given a key. So she went in, sat down at the desk, and then let's say it was a lawyer. He came in, and he said, "Good morning, Jenny. Good morning, Mr. Smith. Good to see you. Nothing wrong yet." So she's sitting there at the desk, and then she sees that Mr. Smith, the lawyer, his eyes gaze across and circle across the room and focus over in the corner on a coffee pot where there's no coffee in the coffee pot. There's no, it's a coffee urn or something, but it hasn't been made. No other expression. She just looks over there, and then goes in the other room and sits down, and closes the door. And so Jenny is left there at her table, wondering what was that about. And what she's wondering about is that gaze, his eyes tracking over to the coffee pot, and then back to her. What did he mean by that? What the hell was that? Then it occurred to her what it was. Oh, I get it, that bastard. He thinks I should have the coffee ready. And he looked over there and saw there was no coffee ready. And he looked back at me as if, where's the coffee? He hadn't said, where's the coffee? He didn't even get an ugly look on his face, but it's just like she's reading it in, she's reading into it. She said, he didn't tell me he wanted coffee. He told me he wanted coffee. I'd make the goddamn coffee. We would have it ready for him, but he didn't tell me that. So I've got the jobs here that I'm told about my jobs. What kind of bullshit is this? So she got more and more angry, and finally just burst into his room and cursed him out, letting the F word fly as fast as possible. Fuck you, fuck you, fuck you, you fucking fuck. Okay, all right. And gets fired. Why? Why? Because he gazed over at the coffee. The same thing had happened with her therapist. She had come to the therapist, my friend, my colleague, and she was depressed, she was lonely, she was frightened about her financial future. She was a mess. But as she began to tell her story, and especially if she told stories about any incidents like happened with the lawyer there, the therapist might have tried in the early going, said, well, did you consider the possibility that he wasn't actually expecting you to have the coffee ready? Are you guys with me on this story? The therapist was like calling into question, was your interpretation possibly off, a little bit dark and negative? The patient would say, are you saying I'm crazy? Well, fuck you! So it has to be the same thing again. So you couldn't raise any question about the interpretation she made of the people in her environment without unleashing the preemptive counterattack on yourself right then. And she would get physically violent, throw boxes of Kleenex and everything else, and you wouldn't know where it was going to end. And so the therapist saw that this woman is so vulnerable to anything that remotely looks like it might be a negative attribution to her, a criticism of her, a rejection of her, a devaluation of her, that she just goes on the attack, but it must be that she's protecting herself from something. And you couldn't talk about her need to protect herself from something, because she'd say, you're saying I'm crazy. So what the therapist learned to do instead was just to be a kind of validating yes man for her. who would hear the stories and say, "Oh, I see why how it looked that way to you." Well, of course, yes, yes, yes. And as long as the therapist stayed in that, yes, 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 I see how it looked that way to you, peace would be maintained between her and the patient. And the patient seemed to relax and be able to benefit a little bit just from the experience of being listened to by somebody who wasn't causing problem. But at the first sign of any difficulty with the therapist's understanding of her, at the first sign the therapist raising a question about how the patient was conducting her life or how she was interpreting or misinterpreting her situations, all atomic bombs would start going off. Now I'm going to tell you what the understanding was as to what was really happening here, and I'm going to give you a little bit of historical background on the patient that sheds light on how this could have come to be. The therapist's understanding, and I agreed with this once I heard the whole story, was that when this woman would experience anybody criticizing her, viewing her negatively, being rejecting toward her, devaluing her, hating her, disliking her, she wouldn't just feel they were disliking her or disapproving of her. She would feel invaded by the dislike and would feel herself turning into the thing she imagined herself as being seen to be. In other words, it's a Langian petrification. Lang's petrification idea is that it's a form of a personal annihilation where, here I am, and you come and look at me, and I sense or pick up that you're seeing me a certain way, seeing me as an object in a certain manner, but then I lose my sense of Georgeness altogether, and I'm swept into this thing you're seeing me to be, as if I'm being petrified into stone. That's what this was. It was specific to any negative criticism. She wouldn't see herself as criticized. She would see herself turning into the criticized object that deserved its criticism, that was worthless and bad, and lose all sense of her genuineness. So the preemptive counterattack was a kind of, I'll use a Langian term again, it was kind of an ontological survival mechanism. As long as she could attack the other person before they could really get around to devaluing her, she would fend off the petrifying power of those criticisms and be able to walk away. But it cost her all her relationships with everybody. That's why she was so hated. Now, how did she come to be this way? I'm going to tell you two stories about her childhood. And I'm just giving you little bits and pieces, and you just have to flow with me and see if it coheres and makes sense to you. Three stories. One, the story of her mother. Her mother was herself made of wood. That's all you need to know. There was no relationship there at all. The mother was emotionally completely unavailable. The mother was like the vacuum cleaner or the refrigerator or something, functioned and did certain things. There was no emotional relationship at all. The only relationship in her childhood, and she was an only child, was her father, who was closer to her mother. But the relationship with the father was fraught with the following difficulties, illustrated by these stories, okay? Here's one. When I tell these stories like this, I want you to imagine yourself into the story, but then multiply the story by a factor of 100, because this kind of thing happened 100 times, not just once. I'm not going to tell you 100 examples, but I'll tell you one. Here's one. Age 4. The father had a pattern when she was 4 years old of just bursting suddenly into the child's bedroom where she'd be playing and say, "Come on, get up, let's go, we're going out to the zoo," or something like that, okay? And it was alarming, disturbing, intrusive, upsetting when he would do that. So the little girl one day went to her father and said, "Dad, I have a request." And he said, "What's that?" "When you come to my room, would you knock on the door briefly before coming in? Because when you just burst in like this, and I'm having my little tea party with my little dolls and all this, and pouring the tea and all that, you get so upset and startled and everything, makes a mess, and it becomes tremendously alarming and disturbing." All right, said the father. Okay, so the next day, this is all part of the first story. She's in there pouring tea or whatever she's doing with her little dollies, or, playing her game. And he comes to the door and he raps once, like twice, like bang, bang, and then a millisecond later bursts in. "Come on, we're going to the zoo, or let's go to the movies, it's time to get out, let's go get some snow cones and popcorn." "Dad, I asked you to knock before you came in." "I did knock, what do you want from me anyway?" See, he had knocked. He'd performed the letter of the law. But he did it so quickly that it was as if it hadn't happened. But then he attacked her perceptions and invalidated her when he responded to her, reminding him that she had asked for him to be more careful coming in. So that was one. There's story two, same story exactly. The father had a favorite pastime. It was to sit with a can of beer and watch wrestling matches on the TV set. And so he would turn the volume up way high. Maybe she's 7 years old at this time, doing her arithmetic. And so he's playing it real loud, and she comes walking out. Dad, could you turn the volume down a little bit? I'm trying to learn my 2 plus 2s or my 7 times 7s or something like that. All right, all right, all right. So she goes back in her bedroom, and the father goes up and turns down the volume like 1 angstrom unit or something, like just the tiniest amount. So it's still just blaring loud, and sits back down, guzzles the beer some more. She comes over, Dad, I asked you to turn the volume down. Why didn't you do it? I did do it. I did exactly what you asked me. What do you want from me? Multiply those 2 stories times 100 or times 1,000. Okay? So the person she was closest to is attacking her reality again and again and again. It has something to do with her intense vulnerability to being just taken over by how she's... See, what a child needs is validation, empathy, support, and understanding. So they can put together a sense of what this world is like, put together a reality they can hold to and know that is theirs. But when you're under assault, it's kind of epistemological assault. Epistemology means having to do with knowledge. So everything that she knows to be true is under relentless assault here. That's what the story is. That's got something to do with it. I'm not even getting to the story yet. We're getting to the story. This turns into a horrible crisis in the therapy you're about to hear. So anyway, the therapy, 8 years long, the 100 or 200 stories about the father and the woodenness of the mother is talked about and talked about. But the therapist really didn't say anything to her other than, yes, yes, I understand, that must have been terrible for you. Yes, yes, I understand. Never raising a question about the patient's continuing self-destructive behavior, because she was still losing her jobs, wrecking her friendships, or wrecking relationships that might otherwise have turned into friendships. So all this is going on. And the therapist told me that she herself, the therapist, was feeling really bad that there hadn't been any progress or any development in the patient's world, because after 8 years you want to see some changes to at least let you know you're on the right track, but it seemed like the patient's struggles were just as bad as ever. This preemptive counterattack was just relentless. There was only one person in the world the patient got along with. It was the therapist. And the only reason she did, the therapist never said anything but, yes, I understand, and of course. That's all she said. That's her full vocabulary, pretty much, and she learned to do it that way. This is a story of how you sometimes maybe need to go 8 years and see no change at all to finally get to a place where some change might take place. Anyway, one fine day, after 8 full years of this, we're getting to my story now, the heart of the story. The patient came in, and the therapist said, hi, Jenny, sit down. How are you doing today? Good to see you. The patient said, something just happened I wanted to talk to you about. And the therapist said, yes, tell me, what was it? She said, well, as I was coming down the street and ready to make the turn around the corner to the building here, where your office is, a man in a white truck, pickup truck, pulled up next to the curb and was waiting there for a minute. And I was going to cross the street, and I was waiting. And the therapist said, yeah, and then what happened? She said, well, he kind of leaned out of the window like this and went like this. The therapist said, yeah. And what happened then? She said, well, I told him to fuck himself. And the therapist said, and tell me what that was, what the fuck himself was about. Why did you do that? He said, because it seemed to me he was pointing at the gutter, like, lie down in the gutter, girl. Like, where you belong is down in the gutter with the rats and the bugs and the cockroaches. Get down. He didn't say any of that, but his hands pointed toward the gutter. Right? The therapist said, oh, yeah, well, of course, if he's pointing at the gutter, what are you to think? Yeah, I can understand. You see, the therapist was being good and was continuing to be that way. The patient then said, well, the only thing is, what happened? The therapist said, what happened then? He said, well, the man kind of looked back like that and looked around, got a kind of confused look on his face and shrugged and then drove off. And I thought to myself, my God, maybe I had misconstrued the meaning of the gesture. Maybe the gesture was, go ahead and walk past, I'll wait for you while you go. Maybe he was a nice guy. What if he was a nice guy? And I just told him to screw himself, fuck himself, and all this over again. Good thing he was a nice guy. If he'd been an asshole, he might have pulled a gun out and blown me away. So, do you understand? So the patient is kind of second-guessing herself. She's thinking about her interpretation, reviewing questions about whether it's valid or not, wondering if she jumped to a negative conclusion that wasn't justified, and almost endangered herself with somebody there. This part is a little hard to explain, but the therapist went into an overwhelming joy state when she heard this. You see, you have to remember, 8 years she's been listening to this woman. All she does is beat up on everybody, and she can only be agreed with. Now here she is finally looking at a situation, making a negative interpretation, reacting accordingly, and then second-guessing and reinterpreting and reflecting on and really thinking about her process of interpretation. That's what you want in a case like this. You want people to be able to develop the capacity to reflect on themselves, consider alternative possible meanings that situations might have. It means they become much more complicated and freer and more flexible to go about the business of life. But people in the grip of really bad trauma can't do that. Trauma, when you're constantly reliving it, destroys the ability to reflect. You just react because things remind you, they're triggers for the trauma that you've been through. So the therapist was really, really excited. And this was her downfall, as you're about to hear, okay, the therapist. And why was she so excited? Well, because you want to see this development, and after 8 years, finally, this is a sign that's there. Secondly, the therapist actually was a student of the process of self-reflection. She had actually written an article or two about the achievement of the capacity for reflection on the part of trauma survivors as a sign of therapeutic progress. When trauma heals, reflection, rethinking, reinterpretation, you become more able to do that. So it's very interesting how that is. And thirdly, there had been some other things the patient had told her, other stories recently that fit in with this. And so she decided she was going to just kind of affirm and reflect what she thought she was seeing. So here's what she said to the patient. Jenny, I think we're seeing a new theme emerge in our work together. And Jenny said, well, what is that new theme? I'm not sure what you're talking about. She said, well, I'm not sure what to call it, but let's call it a theme of reflection or rethinking. And she said, like when the man in the truck came and then he made his gesture, and then you thought at first it was an insulting kind of demeaning thing, you had your reaction to it, then you thought about it differently and came to a different idea. It might have been something else. That's rethinking and reflection. And Jenny, it's not just this one. There are many other stories like this that you've been telling me lately. Perhaps you've forgotten them. Jenny said, what other stories have I told you lately like this? The therapist went on to recount a couple more. And there were a number. I don't know how many there were, but here's a couple that were there. One was this, that just recently the patient had gone to the coin-operated laundromat in the basement of her apartment building, and there had been a man in there doing his laundry. And the man had come up to her and said to her, could I have a quarter, possibly? Okay? And what had the patient done with that? It was the same thing as the man in the truck. She made a horrible interpretation to herself of what he was doing. She kind of thought he was coming and proposed that she give him a blowjob and that she pay a quarter for the privilege of doing it. Okay, something like that, some horrible, demeaning, just disgusting, stupid thing. So she, fuck you, you asshole! I'm not giving you a quarter. Take your quarter and shove it up. Take your laundry and shove it up your ass. This kind of thing had happened, and that man walked away. And later she was left and had mentioned to the therapist, oh my God, what if he just didn't have any change? Okay, it's the same thing. What if he just didn't have any change? It was just a blip for a moment. But the more extended blip had been the man in the truck. What if he was just gesturing that I could go on? Good thing. So it's like the same kind of a thing. And there had been another incident, something like the following. She had been awakened in the morning by the milkman. They had milk deliveries and people at their apartments, the milk would be put out for them. And one morning, 5:30 or something, the milkman had come, and the metal crates containing the bottles of milk were banging against each other real loud, crash, 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 crash. She'd been lying in her bed, awakened by this milkman with his crashing crates. She'd been lying there listening to it, and again, it happened again and again and again, like 10 or 12 times. Crash, crash, crash. She started thinking about what in the world is going on out there. Who is this milkman, and what does he think he's doing? And then it occurred to her what he's probably doing. He's probably pissed off that he has to get up so early and do all this work, and he's looking at all these sleeping babes in their apartments there, and he's so pissed off he has to be up that he's just deliberately smashing the crates into each other that wake up, assholes! So she opens the window real loud and screams bloody murder. Fuck you, fuck you, fuck you, okay, like that. And slams it shut and goes back to bed. But when the window was open, she saw that the crates were huge, and they were too heavy for one man even to pick up, and the man was struggling with them. That's what it looked like it might have been causing the crashing. So she had a little momentary self-doubt there, too. Are you guys with me so far? Wait till you hear what happened. Oh, my God. This part's kind of boring, but stay with it, please. And there was a third story, and I forget what it is now, but it was the same thing. So there were 3 or 4 stories. Not just one, said the therapist, but many episodes involving this new theme. And the therapist had been imagining that she would just mirror the theme, just note that it was present, and hope that would contribute something to solidifying it. Because if a person can reflect and think and rethink and kind of retrospectively reevaluate what they've done with other people, their whole social world can change, and you can be much more flexible with others and adaptable and so on. So she's really happy about the whole thing. The patient didn't seem to have any reaction to this at first. She just listened to it and listened to it and listened to it. And then left. Came back the next day, 2 days later. She was seeing her 3 times a week for this 8 years. Doing almost the entire thing for free, too. This therapist is an angel. She becomes committed to people and won't give up. And there need to be more such angels. So what happened? 2 days later, the patient comes in, Jenny, and the therapist said, well, so tell me, how are you doing? She said, well, I have another story to tell you today. The therapist said, oh, really? Yeah, please do. Tell me the story. Just waiting to see what will be. She said, well, when I left last time here, I went back to my apartment, which was 6 or 8 blocks away where she lived in her building, or however far it was. And I noticed as I approached my building that there were a number of new Hispanic people. I don't know why it's important they were Hispanic, but that's what she said. In the hallway, she lived on the first floor, and 2 or 3, 4 Hispanic young men were there, and they were smoking, okay? And the therapist said, yeah, and what happened then? She said, well, you know I have these respiratory allergies. The patient had tremendous respiratory problems, so smoke or anything like that would just make her start hacking and choking, and it was terrible. So what did you do? Said the therapist. And the patient said, well, I walked up to the men and I explained to them that I had respiratory problems and asked them who they were, and they were new tenants in my next door apartment, next to mine. Yeah, and then what happened, said the therapist. She said, well, they apologized, they promised they would not smoke in the hallway, they were really nice about the whole thing. The therapist thought, oh goody, this is so good. Because before, she just would have come up there like a bitch on wheels and just started screaming, get the smoking, you fucking fucks. You could just see it coming, what that would have been. It wasn't like that. So they were really beginning to reap the benefits of the 8 years of therapy. The therapist is feeling good about herself, kind of wondering if maybe she could write an article about the continuing evolution of the capacity to reflect and rethink and reinterpret. She's thinking all this, not so fast. Don't break out the champagne until you have real good reason to. So what happened then, said the therapist. She said, well, I went to my apartment. Yeah, and then what happened? Well, I went up to my kitchen, and making myself a tuna fish sandwich like I like to, and swishing the mayonnaise into the tuna fish and all this, and I thought I smelled smoke. It's odd. There shouldn't be any smoke in here. These men have been smoking outside, but it wouldn't come from the hallway. What's this doing? I'm imagining. I went back and making her food, but the smoking, the odor of smoke continued to be there and grow stronger. Pretty soon she was starting to hack and cough and sneeze a little bit. What's this smoke? There's smoke in this air here. What the hell is it? And she's wondering and wondering about it. Then it occurred to her what it was. Oh my God, oh my God. She thought these men, that she had asked not to smoke are smoking in the next apartment to hers. They're in there smoking now, and there must be cracks in the wall. You can't see the cracks, but they can be